Never have I seen a free piece of content be as good as God of War Valhalla. I can confidently say that this is not something the developers quickly scrapped up for free brownie points. And it's not a bullshit add-on the developers are calling a free DLC pack that should have been in the base game at launch. It's actual fun, replayable content you can sink your teeth into. While it's not going to make someone who doesn't already like Ragnarok suddenly love it, it will give fans like myself a lot more to play. And I mean it, there's a lot to enjoy here. New bosses, enemies, and story. This really is the best free content I've ever seen in a game by a long shot. Sony Santa Monica really could have charged players $25 or so, and I think it would have been a fair deal. I have never had this much fun with God of War's combat, and as I said earlier, it does give you a lot of new, well, everything. But let me get the spoiler warning out of the way. If you were looking for a small, spoiler-free review, here's what I'll say. It's amazing, and you should go play it. If you have any interest in Kratos as a character, this DLC is worth your time, and from here on out, I will be talking about the Greek-era God of War games, Ragnarok Story, and Valhalla. Nearly every game can implement a roguelike game mode, but very few games can pull it off in ways that make it feel so natural to the experience. Santa Monica inserted Valhalla with God of War's core combat flawlessly. In some ways it makes it feel like Ragnarok was designed to be a roguelike game itself. It's really quite amazing. It has a believable setup with Valhalla and the nature of the setting that God of War is in. God of War is not in a grounded game like The Last of Us. Outside of the zombies, The Last of Us doesn't have too many creative freedoms. You aren't going to see Joel do something spectacular like nearly every God of War character can do. And on top of that, God of War also has good enough gameplay for the repetitive nature that roguelikes entail. And that's a really good thing. It also reminds everyone why these new God of War games have worked just so damn well. God of War is not a game with a good story and passable gameplay, nor is it a game that has a great gameplay hook and a horrible story. It really is the best of both worlds. And that's why I think this roguelike add-on will be universally loved. If this was just a gameplay-focused add-on, I wouldn't complain about it, but I don't think this would have the sticking power outside of hardcore fans. Santa Monica really hit this one out of the park, and they should be given praise for putting this much effort into something that doesn't cost a dime. I know I'm setting the bar at the very top, so let me be clear that if you have played a roguelike before, then you are going to be familiar with what to expect and systems that are in this DLC. As a casual roguelike fan, I feel like the concept of continuously dying and repeating the same content with small variations is the least interesting part of what this genre is. But how gameplay and story are mixed within the genre is what makes each game shine and feel unique. It's what made Hades and Returnal interesting for me at least. And that makes this DLC feel like one big love letter, is that it gives God of War a reason to go back to its roots with Greece. Outside of this DLC already being great, it's a huge part of why I love this DLC as much as I do. I grew up playing the Greece games as a kid, even if I really shouldn't have been playing them. While the past Greece games most definitely are acknowledged and talked about, most players are there for Norse stories and characters, not lore of how Kratos essentially slaughtered Greece. And that's part of the reason as to why I mentioned earlier is that this DLC really does fit well within God of War itself. Valhalla is in a way tormenting Kratos with his past. And if you don't really agree with the word torment, let's agree that it's bringing back memories he's not necessarily proud of. He's also there on a personal journey wondering why he has this unsigned invitation inviting him to Valhalla. Kratos and Mimir are as interested as seeing it through as much as the audience is. And if you've played the DLC, you know that I kind of undersold what I just said. You fight Greece enemies that were in the past games, the entire DLC has a Greece play setting, literal past story elements are brought back up, going all the way back to God of War 1. The music is tuned like the Greece games, and my jaw dropped when I first used the Blade of Olympus. If Sony is going to refuse the idea of a remaster for God of War 1 and 2, then this is almost as good as I'll get. And if you have any knowledge of the Greece games, you can tell that Santa Monica respects and remembers their history. Which is sad because I feel like Sony doesn't. Only a remaster of 3 is available, and playing the others has setbacks because you can only stream them. But that's off topic. Let me go back to Greece. I won't deny that the story will definitely be more interesting if you have played the previous games. A lot of subtle things are referenced that someone who hasn't played them probably won't fully understand. This clip here is actually where Kronos was in God of War 1. Kratos was in the desert trying to find Pandora's box, or the boat space here. This area resembles the very first time people experienced God of War. But even if you know the bare minimum about the previous games, I think people will still end up liking the story. Kratos has changed. He shows remorse for his past actions, he's not proud of what he did. The whole reason Greece enemies are showing up is because these are past actions still haunting him. Just to refresh you, he destroyed all of Greece. This was the end of God of War 3. It was dim and it was lifeless. The sun went out, cities flooded when Poseidon died, lost souls were roaming aimlessly, he slaughtered everything and left it all behind. Most of the Greece gods and Kratos himself really were monsters. Kratos may not have as much depth as some other protagonists, but he isn't a character without emotions or thoughts. He goes as far to apologize to Helios even though he fully understands that he really isn't there.
I know you are a projection of the mind, but for what it is worth, the death I gave you was unjust.
Oh, how touching. Yeah.
He cares about his son, and he shows with his actions that he would do anything for Mimir. And all of this is putting Kratos back in the spotlight of the God of War story. God of War 2018 was a Kratos and Atreus story similar to The Last of Us. It's their story, not just Joel's story, and Ragnarok even took the spotlight off Kratos, letting you play as Atreus and dealing with a whole other section of gods without Kratos' perspective. And that's really not a bad thing. While there are other stories with Mimir and Sigrun, the Valkyries, and pretty much a zero mention of Atreus, this is a Kratos-oriented story from start to finish. Tyr is trying to pass the torch of being the God of War to Kratos. Freya asked Kratos to be on her peacekeeping council. Kratos is fighting in a memory of his original homeland, and what this story really accomplishes is Kratos doing his best to come to grips with Greece. Kratos has evolved to become a gentle giant. But just like in God of War 1's story with Kratos living in nightmares of killing his family, Valhalla is bringing up some of Kratos' worst actions he frowns upon. But just think of what I just said a few seconds ago. Kratos on a peacekeeping council. He really has come a long way from what he used to be. If you were in his path, whether you were a god or mortal, he had no moral thought of killing you unless you were Pandora, since she reminded him of Calliope, his Greek daughter. This DLC really does, in all of the best ways, feel like a God of War 3.5. I even found myself primarily using the blades for what I think is a higher mob density and you don't have a companion. But that's not to say that Valhalla answers every question you may have. This DLC still doesn't answer a few questions that are lingering in my mind, such as why were the Norse gods and the land not affected by Kratos' actions? Someone you may know, Cory Barlog, did say that all of the mythologies exist on this planet simultaneously. But I suppose this answer is deeply hidden in lore that I missed, or Santa Monica doesn't have an answer, so they're just not going to address it. Which kinda sucks, but I'll probably never know the answer to that either. With this DLC feeling like a game in between the Norse and the Greek games, you really do get to see the moral side of Kratos in the Greece setting. When you think back to the Greece games, you'll think of a ruthless god that only cared for vengeance. Sadly, that's what people mainly think of with those games. It's rarely brought up how Kratos really had a simple goal, to be relieved of his nightmares. Kratos lived a daily life thinking of how he killed his own family. His daughter and wife died by his hands. It's a great little callback of Kratos being in Greece and reliving his past. Some of his worst actions are brought up by him sacrificing someone to get past an obstacle. The boat captain, or he'll even find his daughter's flute when you start your run during the closure of the story. The gods of Olympus abandoned him, and that's why he attempts suicide at the end of the first game. Not only was Kratos trapped with his memories, but his own life wasn't even in his hands since he was deemed a needed servant and saved by Athena. After he attempted suicide, he was presented with the throne of the God of War that Ares had conquered at the time. Something Kratos never thought he would care to see again is often presented to him throughout Valhalla. It's really quite amazing how they close this part of Kratos' history. In God of War 1, he never cared for the throne. Just look at his face, he's angry and he knows no way out of his suffering. He couldn't take his own life, nor could he forgive himself or the gods for what he did. He really was enslaved. And when Kratos sees the reflection of himself, he talks down to his past self, calling himself a god of pain, destruction, or even going as far to call himself a god of fools. He knows his past self can't be fixed, but he also knows he can't live with his past self anymore. Kratos knows he's no longer a god of destruction or a foolish god, but rather, just like what was released to the world when he attempted to kill himself with the Blade of Olympus, hope. By the end of Valhalla, it seems like he's come to peace with Greece, sitting on his throne with confidence. This really does wrap up all of Greece in general. In future God of War games, I think there will be some conversation about Greece, but this really is the end. All great things must come to an end, and for the most part, this is enough closure of Greece for an old fan to be satisfied with it. Prior to this DLC, I kept telling myself that the next God of War games were going to be Kratos going back to Greece to try and right his wrongs. But I don't think that's the case anymore, since Greece may be rebuilt at this point. A small piece of dialogue that is easy to miss suggests that Greece is rebuilt. I really don't know how they would rebuild that, but it seems to be done. Tyr mentions in this clip here that Kratos' actions are still spoken about in the years of rebuilding. If I'm analyzing this clip correctly, Greece is rebuilt. The story really was the best part about Valhalla, and seeing that Greece can thrive once more after Kratos' actions is good enough closure for all of Greece in general.
Did you find what you needed? Glad to hear it, brother.
The best part about God of War's gameplay is, without fail, you never have to subdue belief. I know I talked about this a little bit earlier, but you really do have to set aside logic in most other games. Instead of feeling like a human, Joel really does feel like you're playing as a super soldier. He is capable of taking out multiple enemies even when he is hard outnumbered, he will get shot and his miracle bandage makes it so it never happened, or how the infected zombies just swipe at him rather than try and bite him. And trust me, I really can go on. A lot of games have this trait for better or for worse, and yes, I do know that the counter argument is that the damage Joel takes during gameplay isn't canon, but this still feeds into subduing the gameplay side of things for the sake of the story. An average player will naturally get shot over time, you're kind of supposed to. It's just not considered canon damage. If you aren't a fan of The Last of Us, I'm sure you can think of other games where you have to set aside logic with how strong the player character is. Another quick example is how Jin Sakai pounds his chest for health. With whatever game you're thinking of, God of War really doesn't have this issue. It's able to play into itself with Kratos being as strong as he is. Maybe I don't have a cosmic eye for this kind of thing.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
But I have never had to turn my brain off like I have with most other games. Kratos is good at killing and fighting. It's believable that Valhalla would offer him buffs and that he himself is capable of taking all this damage and still have the ability to keep fighting. I know the games usually don't show this side of him, but it's true, he is a skilled warrior. The thing that Valhalla changes least is how combat works on the weapon side of things. Not that I was expecting the game to break, but the game also does not crumble into pieces without having your companion aid you in combat. It's honestly a little bit more enjoyable for me. While Freya and Atreus do have their place in combat, it's nice not having to awkwardly spam square and fight at the same time. I can focus solely on the weapon side of things, even if without a companion, it does make the combat feel a bit more simple. If you force me to point to the biggest weakness of this DLC, I would say it's how you interact with fighting. I found the blades to be the best in most scenarios. Like I said earlier, probably because of the higher mob density, and you don't have your companion. Maybe it's just me, but the axe and spear just felt inferior to the blades. That doesn't really bother me because of all of the Grease callbacks anyway. I actually kind of find it more enjoyable to use the blades in the first place. So if the combat is more of the same, it's time for me to go back to praising the DLC. Because the new enemies and bosses really do stand at the very top of God of War. It's a great mix of Greece and Norse enemies that you fought before. First half Norse, second half Greece. And sometimes there's also a mix of both Norse and Greece in fight areas, which makes it even more interesting. And if you're like me, you ponder on a few things with God of War. 1. Which combat system do you like more, God of War 3's or the new stuff? 2. How would Greece enemies work in the combat system that's in the new God of War games? 3. Why did Sony falsely advertise the series all those years back? Because if they were able to accomplish this, all the weebs like myself would have a new perspective on life. Here, why don't you just take a look at what God of War is supposed to do?
You should play God of War because it'll get you laid.
But since Aphrodite herself can't answer that question, let's go back to the first two questions. Since question 1 is more of a taste perspective on what you personally like, I'm going to quickly address it and say that I think I have more fun playing God of War 3 in terms of combat. I like using God of War 3's weapons more, but the enemy movesets aren't as fun for me. But I think question number 2 is the most important. Grease enemies working within the new combat system. From my count, there are 9 returning Grease enemies to fight in Valhalla. Those being Centaurs, Cyclops, Sirens, Legionnaires in 3 tiers being no armor, a shield, and fully armored with a scythe, Wraiths, Minotaurs, and lastly the fucking Harpies. Just like the nostalgic music this area brings to the table, every single enemy in this area was done faithfully in terms of their movesets and appearance. To state the obvious, we are in a new combat system, so the enemies cannot play exactly like they did in God of War 3, rather the enemies are just faithfully adapted into Ragnarok's combat system. This really isn't a bad thing. These enemies were adapted into Ragnarok's combat system faithfully, bringing back some of their most recognizable moves, my favorite being Sirens and Wraiths. Kratos even kills the Wraiths, like he did in God of War 1 when he pressed circle on them, here it's R3, but he snaps their spine and they do one last final scream of agony, reminding everyone how much more brutal God of War used to be. The Wraith also having its burrow is a fine touch. The reason it stands out in my memory is because you used to be able to pull them out of the ground and juggle them. It kind of looked funny to me. And just because these two are my favorite doesn't mean the others are half-baked either. There is still a lot to love here, and all of the Greek enemies have a callback to their moves. Harpy's dive bomb, or how Kratos stabs the Cyclops' eye as a nod to when he would rip the eye from their socket. Before I wrap up the Greek enemies, I want to emphasize how important it was to get the classical music playing again. Having Helios on your back while Kratos slaughters everything in his path with the Greek music really does emphasize the God of War 3.5 feeling I get from this DLC. The only talking point I would like to address is for the sake of keeping reruns fresh, I wouldn't have been against the idea of having a few challenges of Muspelheim appear in levels, even if they're more on the simple side of killing enemies in certain spots or a time limit. I am sure Santa Monica thought of doing this during the production phase of Valhalla, but who knows, maybe it would have made reruns more annoying.
I thought you might be back. There's always something more worth working out in the mind, isn't there? I'd be too obliged.
There are only 3 bosses I remember fondly from God of War 2018 and Ragnarok's base game. Those being the Stranger fight, Magni and Modi, and Thor's first fight in Ragnarok. I can obviously remember all of the shitty trolls in 2018 or the dragon fight, but I don't remember them fondly. It's not that I think the rest of the bosses are bad, but rather just not for me. All I remember about the new God of War games with boss fights is going in a boss room, unloading all of my runic attacks, and, well, that's kind of it. Using my runic attacks at the start of a fight made most of them wrap up pretty quickly. I don't think they're bad, I think I'm just kind of picky. But Tyr specifically is the best fight in God of War for me. The Sisters of Fate do have a good fight, but rather excellent storytelling thanks to Cory Barlog. But let me stop myself from eating my dessert before dinner because there are a few boss fights to talk about within Valhalla. Tyr will be the last one, but let me quickly address Magni and Modi because there isn't too much I have to say about them. Their moveset does feel a lot like 2018, but now they're just solo. They do have the blue shield bash mechanic in their moveset, so something definitely was added onto them. The main thing I took out of them being in Valhalla is how Kratos talks about how he feels some remorse for them because their whole family was essentially a shit show. The fight ends pretty quickly, and that's not really a bad thing. The fight takes place where you first heard them and where you met Mimir. Like the rest of the DLC, it really is a fun little callback. Now we have the fun stuff, and there were 2 things Santa Monica had to absolutely nail. The first being the Greece setting, and the second being the Tyr boss fight. Because Tyr did take a little bit of a backseat in the main story, and Santa Monica really did him justice in Valhalla. They really did put 2 gods who have held the title of God of War in an area to fight without limits. It also shows what we all wanted to see, and that's how Tyr fights and how strong he really is. At the end of Ragnarok, you can find him throughout story elements meditating or offering advice. It's kind of cool to see that, but seeing him fight was what I really wanted to see. Because the best part about Tyr is he has multiple weapons. He starts with a shield and a spear, and then a Kanoba, which is weird, I've never heard of that name until now. And while I was researching his next weapon I've never heard of, this one is called a Khopesh. And lastly, I can safely say that this one is a katana. Thank God that one was easy. The biggest compliment I have about Tyr's weapons is that there isn't one that sticks out in my mind as the most entertaining one to fight against. I think the reason for this is because we still are in God of War's combat system. Kratos' runic attacks are going to stagger Tyr while you chunk out his health. And also the shield is really strong, being able to block most attacks. When I was fighting Tyr, I kept getting some flashbacks of fighting Gale in Dark Souls. There's a lot to say about Gale, but he kind of speaks for himself. Both of the fights are some of the best the series have ever seen, and they kind of speak for themselves. They're both amazing, and I can really only gush about them. I like Tyr's music, I love the concept of 2 gods duking it out, and Tyr is also another friend Kratos has admired from his journeys. Tyr is one of the few people who can relate to Kratos with being a god of war. The other person was his own brother, Ares, who Kratos killed. Tyr very much so respects Kratos, and like I said at the story recap, at the end of Kratos' victory, he sits in his new throne by the end of it. Valhalla may be the last stretch of God of War content we get for a little while now. Games take a long time to make, so I may not see any more Kratos for a while. One of the complaints I have about the base game of Ragnarok is how hyped up the whole event of Ragnarok is supposed to be. It fell flat and wasn't really all that memorable. Not only was it not my favorite, but it was the end of the main story, and at the time, was the end of the Norse era for God of War. We may or we may not get the Atreus spin-off game that we've been hearing rumblings about. But Valhalla really does put a better closure on this game for me. I finished Valhalla and I was extremely satisfied as a longtime fan of the series especially. Valhalla really does hold up quite well with other roguelike games I've played, although admittedly that's not a lot. The last thing I'll say is that Santa Monica really has always delivered for me. I'm a fan of Sony's first-party games, and besides Ascension, which I only played once, Santa Monica has really only produced gold in my eyes. God of War is one of my favorite series to this day, and it very well may be one of Sony's most important IPs along with The Last of Us and probably Horizon. I know I said this earlier, but this is most likely the last of Greece, and the next mainline game will probably be set somewhere outside of Norse as well. They were able to make the Greece fans happy and the Norse fans happy in one little bow. I would have happily paid around $20 for this and still gushed about it. Not only is God of War one of Sony's best IPs, but Santa Monica is also one of Sony's most important first-party developers. And please, do not forget,
God of War is fucking rad.